Hi, I'm Christoph Durt, and together with Lucy Osler, I'm teaching the seminar Artificial Intelligence and Human Orientation. Now, the seminar has already started. We have had one session so far, and now there are a few new applicants. Of course, they missed the deadline, and it is already a pretty big class. We have participants from 5 continents, which I think is really cool, and also they're really great people. They're mostly PhD students and postdocs, but also some other students and professors, and they are really interesting. Now, the newcomers too are really interesting, and I think they will further enrich the seminar, and we decided to let them in. To help them catching up and to give them an overview over what's going to expect them, I'm recording this video. I would just like to introduce the slides I already introduced without much explanation and without the discussion, of course. Maybe it helps also some people who were there already to recap what we did. So let's get started. This is the seminar's picture. It's meant ironically. It's this typical AI blue. Don't know why it has to be this kind of spacey blue. But then there's this humanoid robot, which looks a bit like a human, but also different in some creepy way. And it also stands with a sign in front of orientation and wants to divert us somewhere else. It wants to divert us. It has its own will. That's often attributed to AI, but we don't think that AI is depicted, is correctly depicted like this. We think that AI is very different. AI has much to do with humans and with our minds, and in particular with human orientation. And that is what the topic of the seminar is. So we spoke about a few things already. One, AI produced text, then AI and human orientation. We asked some questions we want to discuss throughout the seminar, and we discussed the proposed answer. Let's look into AI-produced text. This is Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, which released ChatGPT. He's being interviewed by Lex Fridman, who did a lot of interesting interviews on YouTube and on his website. I can recommend them. This is a rather lengthy interview, and I extracted a very short clip because I think this gets to something really interesting.
Someone said to me this morning, actually, and I was like, oh, this might be right. This is the most complex software object humanity has yet produced. And it will be trivial in a couple of decades, right? It'll be like kind of anyone can do it, whatever. But yeah, the amount of complexity relative to anything we've done so far that goes into producing this one set of numbers is quite something.
Yeah, complexity including the entirety of the history of human civilization that built up all the different advancements of technology, that built up all the content, the data that GPT was trained on, that is on the internet. That it's the compression of all of humanity, of all of the, maybe not the experience.
All of the text output that humanity produces, which is somewhat different.
So they make a few points. One, ChatGPT may be the most complex software yet. Is this true? Think of Google search, for instance, which is incredibly complex. But there you can distinguish between the software and the data, which is not possible in large language models. So large language models are indeed really complex systems because they have so much data they integrated. Now, this data is only one aspect of human knowledge, right? Text by itself is only one aspect, and this data is further restriction. I think we need to add 2 more restrictions here, which is one, that large language models process only one aspect of the corpus, which are statistical relations, right? When humans read the text, that's very different. We are bad in statistical relations, but we understand what the text says. And then fundamentally, they process these statistical relations in one way, which is via predictive mechanisms. So there are quite some restrictions to that knowledge. If we compare this to the typical humanoid robot, let's say Sophia, I have her here.
Okay, I will destroy humans.
Yeah, she wants to destroy humans. Of course, she doesn't want anything, right? She's just a programmed, rather primitive robot. And nevertheless, people get freaked out. And with large language models, this is even more the case. But if you look at what large language models do, they actually do not simulate or replicate or emulate subjectivity. They produce text output, which we read as coming from an author, because that's what we're used to. But that's an attribution to it. Really, what's going on here is something much bigger. There is a text corpus that's enormous. It's not a individual output, but it's of all of humanity, somewhat at least, those who found their way into the internet and other digital text. Maybe it's more like looking into a mirror, where we see ourselves, but not ourselves like as individuals, but as a collective self, maybe like in this picture, which is, of course, a cliche too. Now, what does AI have to do with human orientation? I think one point is already clear from what I said. That is that large language models represent collective patterns, not individual subjectivity. So they're misunderstood if we conceive them as an author or as a subject. That can trip us up quite a bit. We may get into a wrong philosophical view of what is going on there, which might confuse us in our philosophical orientation. But we might also draw the wrong conclusions from this and maybe have an idea of what this artificial intelligence might do in the future that might mislead us. Now, another important thing is that large language models produce text that requires orientation. One, like any text, right? We need to find our way through a text, but also with regard to this new kind of text, which is something really unusual, something we are not used to, something new for us, and which we have to understand somehow and understand what this is and what this really means. Another, third point I already explicated in an essay I wrote is that AI is increasingly used to target and to alter human orientation. And that is something that is already going on. We don't need to wait for the future. I investigated it with regard to search engines, for instance. But it is something that is increasingly coming up, and large language models will also contribute to that. Now, that essay is published in this book. I just got it. I can very much recommend it. You can buy it, but you can also just download the PDF on the HFPO website. And there's my essay and 4 other really interesting essays. Now, what is orientation? Werner Stegmaier, the founder of the philosophy of orientation, who has worked for many years on this, says that orientation is dealing with something one does not yet know about, a new situation. Orientation is the achievement of finding one's way in an unsurveyable and uncertain situation so that one can successfully master the situation. Now, there's no first orientation. We are always already oriented. Orientation is always reorientation. There's no final hold outside of orientation. Orientation is in every conversation, in every text, on every website, and of course in a book. So orientation is manifold. We can speak of different kinds of orientation, such as geographical orientation, mental orientation, pragmatic, communicative, sexual, educational and professional, economic, political, judicial, scientific, artistic, religious, moral and ethical orientations, and other forms of orientation. Now, what are the questions we want to talk about this year? First, which roles does orientation play in the use of language? 2. How do conversations, language, and grammar support, guide, restrict, and distort orientation? 3. How does AI-generated text change orientation? These are questions we want to discuss with regard to Werner Stegmaier's book, The Philosophy of Orientation. More questions. How did writing transform humanity and alter societal intelligence? How do large language models process written language, and what do they extract? How do theories of meaning account for the capabilities of large language models? These are questions we want to discuss with regard to a text by Christopher Manning, who is a professor for linguistics and deep learning at Stanford University. More questions. Is handwriting a digital technology? Seems rather analog, right? But it's using the alphabet, which is arguably digital. 2. What is the relation between mathematics and writing? Right? The large language models process writing, but by mathematical means. 3. How does computation of writing change visual, spatial, geometrical, and mathematical orientation? These are questions Sibylle Krämer asked in her article we want to discuss together with her. She will join us for the discussion. She has been working on these topics and lots of more topics, in particular with regard to language and digitalization, for decades, and she will join us, and I'm very much looking forward to our discussion. More questions. How does speaking continuously create new situations? How do we find our way through language? And how far can human speech production be compared to computational processing of language, and then how far not? These are questions we want to ask with regard to a text by Thomas Fuchs, a professor for psychiatry and philosophy at Heidelberg University, and he will join us for the discussion too. More questions. How does culture shape large language models? 2. Does it matter how we treat large language models? 3. How does our treatment of large language models impact social orientation more generally? These are questions we want to discuss with regard to a text by Alexis Elder. Of course, we might introduce more texts and do changes on the way, depending on the interests of the participants. Now, before we come to the last set of questions, I would like to talk about the answer we discussed. Of course, it's not the answer by a human, but by ChatGPT. I gave it a prompt. Please write 2 paragraphs on how large language models change our orientation and what Werner Stegmaier's philosophy of orientation can say about the topic. And it did better than what I expected. It did 50% better, actually. It didn't just write 2 paragraphs, as I asked, but 3 paragraphs. So these are the 3 paragraphs. I'm not going to read them right now. If you want to read through them, just pause. We discussed this, and the first paragraph doesn't say too much. It's actually a little funny that it says that there's, with regard to our own language and other language, it's a bit repetitive. It's a typical response. I didn't cherry pick. This is the first response it gave to us. It's not that helpful. The second paragraph is really interesting, but it's also something very much discussed with regards to large language models bias, so it's not unexpected here. The third paragraph, we had some doubts with regard to its accuracy, and in any case, these answers are rather broad, which is, of course, typical. They get better if you continue asking. So, the last set of questions we're going to discuss on our next meeting. First, how does writing impact how we orient ourselves in the world, thought, and communication? 2, how does writing augment memory, knowledge, thought, communication, and philosophical understanding? And in how far does it hinder them? 3, how do large language models aggravate the problems with writing? And how far do they remedy some of the traditional problems of writing, such as that there is no response? Text is somehow dead, right? As says an unusual author in this context, namely Plato, in his Phaedrus, which we want to discuss with regard to these questions. Why Plato? It's rather interesting. It's a very old text, of course. Well, today we are not sensible anymore to the changes text brings to our lives, our understanding, our communication, everything basically. But at that time, during Plato's time, it was a much discussed topic, and Plato too picked it up. His teacher Socrates didn't write anything. He refused to write, but Plato did, and he criticized writing in his writing. So that's an interesting tension, and he has a couple of really interesting things to say about writing. This is important for us because large language models operate with writing. So the first topic we want to discuss here is the relation of the written word to knowledge, memory, understanding, orientation, and philosophy. And then the relation between philosophy, rhetoric, and the output of large language models. Rhetoric is something that Plato criticizes, at least if it's done without regard for the truth, which is something that we talked about in our first meeting already with regard to the concept of bullshit, as Harry Frankfurt defines it, that there is a lack of regard for the truth. We can, in our next meeting, we can discuss those connections and the more fine-grained details of these questions. So please read the text, the excerpts at least are recommended. The whole text is also really interesting if you would like to read it, and think about these questions and think about what the text can say about that. So I'm looking forward to see you soon, and have a good time reading and thinking about these things.